Hello, I am Joshua William Gelb, founder of Theater in Quarantine.
Hi, I'm Normandy Sherwood. I'm a collaborator and co-creator on Phantom of the Opera and a scenographer, director, writer. I do a lot of things.
Yeah.
I'm Jay DeLeon. I'm the Director of Engagement at Skirball, and I'm jumping in to ask some questions today. Um, First of all, it's Halloween, which is a delightful confluence of timing that we happen to be reporting on Halloween. Um, this is Theater in Quarantine's second Halloween show at Skirball. The company obviously started during lockdown, which had all kinds of horror, built into its premise, right? I mean, at the time, the world was simply full of horror. So I'm curious, how does horror inform the work more broadly? Does this Skirball collaboration give you an invitation to explore that aspect? Like, what's the draw to monstrosity?
I think horror within the confines of theater is often underexplored. And there's something really challenging in creating a visceral response through horror, particularly in an in-person live audience, especially. And so, yeah, I don't think theater in quarantine originally kind of was exploring the uncanny, the horror, the horrific, the monstrous. But these Halloween slots have really provided us an opportunity to go there and sort of unabashedly see what we can bring to that genre. And just, it is a genre, right? And I think that's what's really fun about it. It has tropes. It has ways of telling story and shorthand, and it's fun to just play in that sandbox.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that like horror is hard in theater, partly because you don't have as much, if traditional theater, control of the frame in a certain way. An audience is sitting together and you're sort of presenting something to them, and there are ways you can frame things, but the reality of people's bodies and where they are is sort of maybe counteracts the transport of the horror, unless it feels like something's going wrong and is dangerous. Like, um,
Right.
uh, but I think that like one of the sort of affordances of the form that Josh has been developing with theater in quarantine is that it can borrow from these filmic moves that do allow for horror because they're less they're like transporting in a different way.
That's so great. The idea that the visceral response in theater is so hard to can be so hard to predict unless it does seem like something is going wrong, as you say, which, famously, and I definitely want to get into this, Phantom is such a meta theatrical piece, right? We've got, the chandelier, the stage within a stage. Um, but I just picking up on the filmic aspects of it, I know you have such a fabulous collaborator in your sound designer. I'm curious how the sound, if that's something that helps tap into like that visceral response, right? There's something about, and especially seeing the show, I was so struck with kind of the ghost of space in the sound design. Like you can hear like the bigness of other theatrical spaces, especially in like Christine singing. Like you can hear the other rooms that are sort of implied in that space. Um, but the sound design does so much for that sense of like creeping, uncanny dread. Um, yeah, I'm curious how that. Can you talk a little bit about how, I mean, design is so important. Every aspect of design is so important to the company, but how does the sound, it seems like your secret weapon almost.
Well, I mean, certainly with Nosferatu, Alex Hawthorne, who designed both, they brought such a specific lens to that piece. We were working in 3D, and so sort of the big challenge there was, how do we create a digitally immersive encounter. So the image is jumping off of the screen, and Alex was very interested in figuring out how the audio could too. And so we kind of created binaural, that binaural experience that resulted in spoiler, the vampire kind of escaping the phone and talking literally to you. And I think that was a really exciting starting point for Phantom, knowing that we weren't necessarily going to repeat that trick, but that we were interested in challenging ourselves to try to play more with real, like live sound. We wanted Christine. We had an opera singer in Sophie Delphus, and so we wanted live singing on stage in an apartment that we're filming from. And Alex was just super present in the rehearsal room from the very beginning, originally in Berlin, remotely, and then in person. And was just really responsive to how we can make an exceptionally small space feel grand, feel huge, and also feel a little haunted. So whether we were playing with Sophie's live voice or these like distorted recordings of like old phonograph records, I think Alex really does find a sort of sense of space that is exceptionally present and eerie. I do, gosh, I think at some lunch break, Alex was found in the courtyard of my building, dragging like cinder blocks around and recording them. So that definitely happened.
Just a horrifying noise.
And Josh, I am like not recalling right now, but did we have in Nosferatu, were we using live miking?
No,
No, so that was like a big change or like a new layer for this, which was really exciting, challenging, awesome to play with, was like, what does it mean to have live mics sometimes in the space where we're also doing a million things in the
yeah, I
backstage?
mean, because the performance is so much about juggling, and the silent movie ethos is really helpful because it does allow us to communicate across the stage, and while a scene is going on, we can call for props. So it's a very distracting backstage experience, and as soon as I mean, as Hollywood learned, as soon as the talkies began, suddenly the soundstage has to become exceptionally organized and focused when you turn a live mic on, and so it really does change the whole process.
Was that part of because only Christine and the Phantom speak. Am I correct in recall? Okay, so the other characters do sort of adhere to that silent movie ethos. You're able to use the title cards with their dialogue. Was part of that decision to sort of split the cast in terms of voicing a practical one, so that you could have those moments of, unrecorded opportunities for like the backstage chatter to like make some of those set pieces happen.
It certainly helped.
But I think it was more conceptual,
Yeah.
like, than practical. Like, yeah, it certainly helped. It turned out to be useful in a lot of ways, but I think there was a desire to use title cards, and like I remember some conversations about like what should the convention of like who speaks be. And I think it felt like to only hear Christine and the Phantom was to like get more intimacy, or like to underscore the intimacy of that relationship. Yeah, it felt like a decision about like how we were sort of like focusing the show.
Yeah. I've always been so interested in what happens if you set Phantom of the Opera not in the glory days of an operatic kind of experience, but in something that feels a little closer to now, where it still represents a position of power, but is also a struggling, arts institution like all the others. And so a way to reflect that was to really lean into the title cards and the silent movie ethos when we're really in the opera house, that they are functioning with an art form that is in some ways antiquated and follows conventions that are a little alien to a lot of viewers. So that kind of conceptually worked out, I think, and allowed us to have the sort of specialness of Christine specifically, like why is she so profoundly interesting as a performer, as a singer? What is the Phantom bringing to Christine through their lessons? And in our world, that is sound itself.
It it's such a conceptually that break is so interesting for the audience. It also gives sort of that, I mean, you mentioned the Nosferatu sort of escaping the frame and speaking directly to the audience. It sort of gives that there's a seamlessness to the switch. I think it took me a moment to realize like, oh, I'm hearing this actually. What does that do to the rest of the story? Which was really, yeah, really conceptually interesting, but in such a fluid way, right? It took me a second to sort of catch up with what was happening, which I thought was really interesting because you're so immersed in that logic and those conventions. But of course, you know, I was toggling back and forth between the audience view and the backstage view, so that sort of switching also made sense just in terms of the doubleness of what's offered to the audience, right?
Mm.
Which I have many questions, so I'm going to try to approach them with some kind of logic because it does there's it's always so delightful to talk to you two about the work because it asks or prompts such interesting like existential formal questions about theater itself, right, and theatricality, which I always really appreciate. Um, but maybe I'll pick up on the phantom of it all, right? And you address Josh in that opening monologue head on that question, like why phantom now? Um, and the theater in quarantine version of Phantom gives just a whole new meaning to the concept of an artist in residence, because which is so funny, just a delightful joke that caught me by absolutely by surprise. Um, with theater in quarantine, there's such an interesting inversion of the logic of the theater as a kind of house, which is, you know, it's referred to as a house in the text, right? It's also a home for so many of us, but then Josh, famously, you're inviting us and your collaborators and the audience into your own home and apartment. How do you live there with all that, with all the art? But the audience is also experiencing the work. Many of us are experiencing the work from our own homes and domestic spaces. So you have this real like porousness of those ideas, which again brings a kind of intimacy to the work. So I'm curious how you think through those opportunities as you're developing the work, what emerges in these overlaps, what other opportunities like did Phantom as a text offer to both of you?
Mm. I mean, I love the distinction of the opera house as a house, and I think that's just sort of used very commonly in the operatic world, right? It is the house, um, and to that end, like the Phantom has created as you know one of the great outsider artists, right? Their own home within this house, you know, deep underground. In the movie, you've got, in the 1925 movie, you've got that sense that the Phantom has culled together this like space from all these like discarded set pieces. And so the ways, so in that respect, the theater in quarantine studio is not dissimilar. It is a reflection of all the work that we've done and all the past work that we've done. Yeah, to that end, I find this question of home and what is a home and what is an art space to be sort of beautifully and sort of deliciously teased out in the dramaturgy of Phantom. Of course, the artist in residence line started as just sort of a joke with Shoshana Tarko, our mediaturg, who, uh, we kept thinking about like, oh, these managers have been extorted for years, right? They are paying out off the Phantom monthly. How do you justify that in the budget? And what better way than to put in an artist in residence line? So anyway, yeah, it's a piece about an institution, and in many ways, the ways that the Phantom lives both within it, inhabits it, but also is sort of deeply outside of it. And so, in that respect, there's a sort of beautiful tension between those two. What is home? What is an institution? How do we call it home? What is an unhealthy relationship to home, to that home, and to the work, and how it consumes us all in various different ways. So anyway, I find Phantom just a delightful text that allows an entry point for all of those questions.
Yeah, and that's great. I'll just add that it's like, there's also something about like the way a home can stifle you, or like, I mean, there's porousness, but there's also being enclosed. And I guess what I'm thinking about is like, you know, I don't know, are we not doing spoilers in this interview?
Oh, spoil.
Spoilers. Yeah, in the final image of like, conflagration,
Yeah.
and sort of destroying a home. And then I'm just thinking back to the night when we first tried that, and it was like, are we going to burn down Josh's apartment? And we didn't. We figured out a very safe way to do it. But
Talk about something. Yeah. Oh, I mean, it's such a small piece of paper, which is so hilarious in the context of where it sits in the camera frame. But it is like you bring an open flame around theater people. That is a something that no one takes lightly. Uh, but also, of course, within this whole conversation around the Phantom and the Phantom's place within the larger like house, opera house, is that sense of voyeurism, is that sense of the Phantom lurking behind walls and witnessing all of these like very private encounters and of course pulling threads, which we sort of mirror in two ways, right? We literally dramatize that. We have these like peephole sequences where you kind of the audience is positioned as the Phantom, sort of lurking and kind of witnessing these half-viewed sequences and moments. And then, of course, the audience can simultaneously toggle to the backstage camera and literally lurk in a much less curated way, entirely uncurated way, aside from the frame of the shot on our process as we make the thing.
The moment of fire really did immediately bring me into questions of the institutional context, right? Because it is so difficult to, for such important reasons. Famously, the theater is very flammable, it's incredibly dangerous, etc. But it also brings in this moment of absolute high stakes, right? Like there's something about like lighting something on fire in your own home, yeah, that really does, bring a kind of sharp look at the kind of risks that they're willing to take and the kind of risks they're able to take beyond the institutional context, right? Because there's something so interesting about the meta critique of the institution from within Phantom, that really fabulous opening monologue slides between like you're sort of in putting on the makeup, you're sort of embodying that slide between on stage, backstage, the camera switches into black and white. So you're giving the audience this slow sinking into the theatrical space, right? But you're also able to do this in relation to the institution, NYU, Skirball, but from a few blocks away, right? There's something really interesting about that strange institutional relationship that is present in the piece, right? So I'm curious, that must come with both freedom and constraints, right? You're able to set things on fire without having to go through, all of the processes that would entail, like within the stage in a different way. So I'm curious, were there other moments in developing this piece in particular that clarified some of those institutional, um, yeah, limitations, the freedoms that you're able to take from within this other space?
I had a funny meeting with another large institution at some point, unnamed, where they said they were very excited about the work Theater in Quarantine was doing, and they would by all means be interested in working with us, but that they couldn't quite fathom how Theater in Quarantine's approach to art making would fit within the confines of how they allow artists to work within both the rehearsal time frame, the very idea of how design has to be kind of all complete before you even enter a theater, and of course the very idea that the performers have anything to do with the tech is anathema to them. And it was very upfront and honest, and I appreciate that. That being said, like, yeah, there's so much that feels like I mean I wouldn't say necessarily at NYU Skirball, which is a home to a lot of work that does whatever they want to do, but in terms of many of these other institutions that have a sort of deeply ingrained process. That are slightly less open to experimentation, maybe not necessarily because they would like to be, but because their schedule insists on it. Yeah, I think Theater in Quarantine is operating in a way it can do whatever it wants in that apartment. And again, that's the way we're the Phantom. And it's amazing that we're able to have an opera singer sing and somehow no one's complained yet.
That is the obvious follow-up question. Have the neighbors complained about the opera singer? Which,
Not
it's
once. Yeah.
New York apartment living offers its own kind of unofficial institutional requirements. But yeah, that is a, you must have really wonderful neighbors.
Or deaf, I'm not sure. Uh, that being said, no, they've been really wonderful. They're much more likely to complain about a neighbor who is doing a lot of construction. I mean, my brother, funny enough, saw the show a couple days ago and remarked, like, "Oh, I live with an opera singer too in my building." And to him, it was just sort of a rite of passage of living in New York that, and in some ways, it is its own cliche when you think about any sort of like moving to New York old movie, right? Like there's always an opera singer in the building singing scales. So we're just doing it nightly.
Giving people that experience.
Providing the New York ambiance.
Mhm.
So I want to ask about the backstage of it all, but also in Normandy, I'm curious how much this was part of your vision for this piece too. You have such an incredibly expansive playing space compared to Nosferatu in this piece, right? You've gone beyond the closet. The closet still features, the closet's part of the playing space, but now you have these like different areas to work with, right? Plus the behind the scenes cameras, they're available for the audience to like choose which view they want to take. Which again, as you said, Phantom is such a backstage play that seems so perfectly appropriate to give people that opportunity. But there's also, I'm curious to hear more about how you came to those decisions, and also what there's something so there's like a masterclass happening in terms of the behind the scenes work, right? You're able to see how all of the magic happens, which is such an interesting experience in terms of the theater's reliance on a kind of suspension of disbelief, right? You're giving the audience the opportunity to really see the tricks happen and then immerse themselves back into the magic, right? Like that back and forth, and the kind of autonomy you're giving to the audience, I think is really interesting approach, right? And people also have the choice to just be in a stream that doesn't have that backstage view, right? To just stick with the single frame. So I'm curious about both what led to the decision to take yourself out of the constraint of the closet, and also, yeah, what led to that doubled vision.
Well, I mean, I think Josh can speak to this too about just sort of like the thought of what the apartment can accommodate. But I think there was from the beginning a thought of like, this is a big, this it had we want to go big, excuse me, bigger. We want there to be more peak performers, like really pushing the limits of what can happen. And then also just sort of like wanting a space that is like the opera house, like that's what we have been calling that white box that a lot of the opera house stuff happens in. Um, but it's interesting. I mean, I think that like just thinking back to Nosferatu, like once we were up and running, Josh made kind of like a sped up version of what the backstage looks like. That we then I think it was posted online. We showed it to students, but it was like delightful. I mean, delightful to see like the sort of like review of like where everyone was and what everything looked like. And in that show, we did have like maybe 3 people at a time come and watch the shows live. And the feeling of that backstage experience, like there was something so exciting about for people who saw that because they were kind of toggling between the what is live happening in front of them like in the room and then what is live happening on the frame, like there's a monitor for them, and just the excitement of like seeing things come together and like the delight of how different it looks in real life versus mediated real life. That I think that was like a desire to kind of like how can we expand that effect to for more than 3 people a night, like and I mean, I think the last thing I'll say is that like over the years I've worked on shows, many a show where there it wants to be a moment of like revealing the backstage, and like it's like you kind of can't, it's like to curate what the backstage looks like is to give a false, it just looks bad. It's like immediately you can tell. So like this is, except for the framing of the camera, a pretty uncurated backstage. It's just like what people need to do in order to create the images. And I think that like just showing that labor is really interesting to me and exciting, that like that's something that audiences can have access to, is like what does it take to create an image that creates that suspension of disbelief, or that looks so like beautiful and impossible, and like to be able to see that. I just think that's like an exciting thing for an audience to get to have a way into.
There's so much about this work that is indebted to that period during the pandemic where we were talking a lot about like what is theater and what constitutes theater, and particularly at a moment where proximity is not possible. And so liveness became, at least in my mind, but I know in the minds of many others, the sort of the thing to strive for. How live can you be? And so, yeah, the backstage stuff was always so exciting in that it allowed us to reveal like how live we were doing it, that we weren't using a lot of pre-edited footage, that we were trying to do all of this like live compositing. We'd started doing hybrid performances with the New York Public Library in like 22, I think. And then more recently, like Seventh Voyage was at Under the Radar with like a full in-person audience that could really see everything. Um, which is great for the in-person audience, but our digital audience has always been a little stuck with the short end of the stick there. We've done like small picture-in-picture, but even then, you know, it's so curated that you don't get that bigger sense of like, how is this possible? And so this has been like something I've been striving for and trying to find a way to achieve for a while. Turns out 2 live streams that are synchronized, that an audience can autonomously choose between, is actually a challenging thing to get coded and made. Which is why it was really exciting when Skirball showed me this, it's not Skirball, sorry, when Culture Hub showed me their new Culture Hub broadcaster platform, which didn't immediately allow for this toggle function, but that we had some discussions about if that was possible, and indeed it was. And so we tested it out on a different project last spring. And then, you know, it is still a new platform. You know, there are still questions about how many viewers it can withstand. We are troubleshooting this thing nightly, and you know, we just said, let's dare to do it. Let's dare to put this, you know, show on the platform for the run, and it's been going really well. That being said, I just love that you bring up suspension of disbelief, Jay, because I often say that in the digital space, there is no suspension of disbelief. That audiences have been so trained to like seek out and assume that CGI is somewhere, that there is, you know, editing manipulation happening, and now with AI, that doubt in the veracity of what is being seen is even more expansive. That as a digital artist, like, to prove liveness is becoming more and more impossible. And so to that end, this is my best effort thus far. And really thrilled that we've been finally able to make it happen. And with Phantom, which again kind of has a nice sort of behind the scenes backstage angle to it. So it feels like part of the piece.
That's such a that 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 question of the proof of liveness. I mean, you speak to the camera at the beginning. You know, I watched it last night, and you said it's, you know, Thursday, October 30th, it's 8:04 p.m., right? You're doing the equivalent of like holding up the newspaper in a hostage situation, which invokes a kind of horror anyway. Like the need to prove life implies a horrifying situation, right? So you're starting the audience with a sort of resonance, which is so great. But there's something about that. There's something so incredible, and I want to hear more about that impulse, and there's something about the digital space that requires an emphasis on the liveness as the magic, right? The audience can see all of what makes the visual effects and the set pieces happen, right? You're sort of revealing the theatrical magic, but there's something about the underlying quality of liveness that is essential to the experience, right? And it's something that you've insisted on, as you know, in your collaborations as Theater in Quarantine. There's something about really investing in that quality of liveness that is so fascinating and important. So I'm curious. Yeah, there's something. I'm curious what the continued use of the apartment and like playing with and pushing the bounds of that space, which, you know, it's changed so much since the initial experiments. I'm curious what the format continues to offer to your shared creative practices, right? You really are asking these really heavy formal questions, right? About that deep magic of theater, right? In relation to liveness, and how do you really invest in it deeply?
Mm.
So yeah, I'm curious what's continuing to surprise you about working in that space, and you're clearly continuing to push the limits as you emerge from the closet into the larger apartment using these two formats. Yeah, so I'm curious what continues to bring you back to the space.
Well, I think like the Phantom in a way, uh, there's a sort of a sort of uh, feeling that like, oh, is theater ignoring the digital space? Not just in our desire to get away from the pandemic, but just in general, is theater uh, inherently like anti-digital? Uh, and how do we contend with that when the culture uh, is sort of progressing into being such a hybrid experience? Uh, and so, as someone who's very much committed to theater, as a theater artist, as someone who is interested in liveness, who is interested in feats of liveness, and uh, to perhaps a fetishistic or masochistic extent. I am continuing, I'm continuing, and I have a continued interest in pushing how the theatrical can be experienced in an exceptionally live digital way. That, again, I don't expect will necessarily resonate immediately in the coming years, but I'm hoping is laying some sort of foundational groundwork for what live performance looks like in a culture that is even more uh, predominantly digital. And so to that extent, digitally mediated. And so to that extent, yeah, I feel a lot in common with the Phantom, who, and the Phantom can be perceived as ultra conservative, or can be perceived as deeply avant-garde. I mean, there's been so many different versions of what the Phantom is after. But I think it's interesting thinking about why the Phantom is in an opera house, what that represents, and what is the Phantom's like ultimate challenge to this kind of institution, and I think it is to stop to think of how we can do things differently, and how we can not just preach the idea of reaching new audiences, but actually aim to meet them where they're at.
Yeah, when I think about sort of the ways that people prove liveness in their everyday lives all the time with digital spaces, like that first moment of the show we were taking off of course, like a get ready with me video, where it's about like sort of the authenticity of the off the cuff. You're seeing someone in a private space and they're telling you their thoughts, and that's there's something about like the relative aesthetic of it being unstaged and like authentic, that is something that like is just a part of how people experience the world now, is like a digitally mediated, you know, authentic thing. And then the other thing that was coming to my mind is like, you know, going to the theater or going anywhere, like a lot of what people want to document themselves being somewhere. I was here. I guess I'm thinking about the other Phantom of the Opera that's happening right now, and like all of the pictures I'm seeing on Instagram of like people who like, I'm getting ready to go to this thing, or like, that it's about like being able to show I went somewhere. Um, and I don't know exactly how that figures into like this sort of future of digital theatrical interaction, but I do think it's like this show is sort of raising some interesting questions about like how does the, you know, performance of everyday life like necessarily include the digital now, and like what does that mean for theater? Like, you know.
I love that you brought up Masquerade. Let's just talk about Masquerade for the rest.
People will be so confused. That performance of everyday life in terms of the masking, you have the Phantom has so many different masks, which I'm curious how that creative choice came about. I mean, the most famous Phantom has that iconic, single look. So there's something so playful about bringing in like different eras of masks and different opportunities to reference other kinds of masking. I mean, I'm also, I'm wearing a mask right now. I'm in the office, and I mask regularly. There's also something about people's desire to see your face, which is such a remains something that we grapple with, right? That idea of like the performance of everyday life, the sort of Goffman-esque, like what happens when you strip away to your authentic self. I mean, there's a kind of um, these other meta questions about authenticity in everyday life that that your that Theater in Quarantine Phantom brings up in particular. Um,
I love, I mean, as the performer performing the Phantom nightly, I think a lot about the Lon Chaney, but also the Andrew Lloyd Webber iteration, and like that there is such a performance of beauty implied in the first half of the experience of when we meet the Phantom. Uh, and I think a lot about like Lon Chaney's just gorgeous old like melodramatic gestures. It's so genteel. It's so beautiful, uh, and romantic, and the way you kind of gravel your voice to sound, to sound like masculine and desirable, and and then, of course, the mask comes off, and you realize that how much of a performance that was. Um, so that's just something I've been absolutely more and more conscious of as we go. I've always just, look, I don't think we could ever go far enough in terms of having multiple masks for the Phantom. I think there's something like in the movie itself, or the 1925 movie. He has two, right? There's the like uh, creepy baby face doll mask that is his usual mask, and then there's the skull. The Mask of the Red Death, and I think that was probably our inspiration to think that there, like, why wouldn't he have a mask from every opera? Why wouldn't, like, anytime there's a mask, you're in a new mood, you've got a new mask. Um, so that was absolutely where that came from, and I'm so glad we leaned into it. I do think, at the end of the book, at the end of the movie, there's a sort of major choice that Christine is offered, to basically like save herself and marry the Phantom, or blow up the opera house and blow up her lover Raoul, um, and herself as well. Um, so quite a choice. But anyway, like those are usually represented by these like very bizarre tchotchke trinkets, I think they're called in the book, of a scorpion and a grasshopper. Not sure where LaRue got that. Everyone's leaned into it. We leaned into it for a bit, and then we decided not to. And I'm kind of glad, because I think it leans more into the imagery of the masks themselves, that we have these two masks that become the choices. One being this more, the romantic face that the Phantom has put on for Christine, and that is, representative of their marriage and their love, and of her saving herself, and the opera house, although sacrificing herself. Um, and of course the skull, which is death for all, and death for, the institution. Um, I will quickly note here, because I meant to earlier, that I remain fascinated that the Phantom is offering to blow up the opera house. Of course, some decades later, Pierre Boulez, this composer, also, made the same claim. and basically said, you know, that the only way to do new work it would be to blow up all the opera houses. Now, obviously, I think Boulez, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, walked that back eventually. Uh, but it remains this big question of like, how do we create institutional change, not just in arts institutions as well. And so, anyway, what the skull represents both like mass death, but also in some ways a sort of way of thinking about rebirth.
I would also just add that like we looked at a lot of masks. The mask selection process took a long time and it had a lot of things. And so and I think it was maybe because there is such an icon, you know, in the culture of what the Phantom of the Opera is. And so it felt, of course, like we want to see a lot of things and we want to really think about, and I feel like this landing on this sort of multiplicity is what felt right in a certain way, that it's like that there is a shape-shifting quality to the Phantom, and that we're not, and also just the sort of like we're not positing a different icon. We're saying that this Phantom is mutable.
There's something about that too that I appreciated in terms of the meta reference to the theater as a space of masks, right? Taking away that single, or like the really sticking with one iconic image gives you that fluidity, which yeah brings in questions about the form, right? The comedy and tragedy masks, which I thought was really effective in bringing in these like meta threads. Um, I think I have one more question because I know we're running out of time, but and thinking about the backstage, just trying to draw some threads together, thinking about, you know, blowing up the opera houses. There's something theater in quarantine emerged in a time when so many people were asking questions about survivability, the survivability of theater as a form, like what kinds of changes might have to be made going forward. But it was also coming from like sort of the Me Too restructuring of, you know, the kinds of workplace safety opportunities that were not being met in terms of, you know, offering performers and artists sort of breaking with a kind of past of the great um, abusive geniuses of yore, right? Sort of moving away from what kind of like pain and sacrifice had to go into an art form. So there's something interesting about like, again, digging into the kinds of necessary change that you're thinking about in terms of like how to continue honoring theatricality, liveness, the potentiality, while leaving behind some of the things that make it difficult for artists to create work, right? So one thing that struck me in the backstage view, right? And I was one of the people who got to see the Nosferatu in the apartment a couple of years ago. It really was an incredible experience. And being able to see like the intense, it's not a curated space, but it's heavily choreographed, right? There's so much that has to go right, especially in like the tightness of that space. There's a kind of DIY ethos that's invoked, right? You're revealing the magic of how these things are happening and potentially like inviting the audience to take on that great tradition, right? The tradition of artists making work in their own homes is such like a long-standing and important one, especially, you know, as it's sort of held against something like the opera house as this concept, right? The idea of an opera house and what it stands for in terms of the institutionalization of art, you know, versus the DIY, you've got a closet, why not put on a show kind of ethic that you're really digging into, right? So I'm curious, in terms of that, like um, tradition of carving out your own space to make work, right? What other, and in terms of thinking of it as like a master class and how to accomplish that, like, do you have advice for young artists? I know, Normandy, you're also a teacher. How does this sort of like almost pedagogical um, approach, or does that have any space in the work, or is it something that sort of emerges after the fact when you're able to look at what you've created?
Um, I mean, I guess I would say, well, for me, in terms of this sort of DIY ethos, that's how I've always made theater, and it's I had a time in my life where I was maybe for a little while trying to follow more of a traditional like playwright track and like send work out. And I got so frustrated with waiting around. And so, I mean, and that's just sort of like, you know, it's complicated these days because when I was coming up in the theater, there was much less expectation for like compensation or anything like that. And so I think like rightly, many young artists are and students even are feeling like that they want to have the boundaries about what they will and won't do. But at the same time, you've got to make the thing you want to be in, basically. I mean, I think that it's like that's said in so many different ways, like create the world you want to see, create the work you want to encounter, but like that um I guess just that there's something about like the home space and even the tradition of like artists working in the East Village in their apartments, like Jack Smith and all of these, 60s and 70s people, that I think like in visual art performance, that ethos is maybe still a little bit more present. This that it is about that the process is built into the product and it's about the labor and it can be start as something homemade and then get big and get a lot of attention. There aren't the way that theater in quarantine is conversant with theatrical conventions, but also creating a space that's like, building its own process, right? And bringing people in its own way. Um, to me, that feels like that's the way that you enact a vision, right? Or like that you would stay true to a vision is like by controlling a lot of the circumstances in your own home. So that, I mean, that's where I come from. I know, certainly there are lots of different ways to make art, but if you want to make it right now, do it in your house. That's a fast way.
I mean, but yeah, and to that end, I don't know how much I don't know how much theater in quarantine has to say to younger artists because in so many ways they're already doing it, right? Like, and by creating work and putting it online, like they are actively doing exactly what we're doing. Maybe we just kind of put a little bit more of an aesthetic lens on it, maybe. I'd even say there's already a movement right now of young artists who are doing work, a lot of live in-person work in apartments, because there have been so many shutdowns of all of so many spaces where young emerging artists were putting up work. They've been closing one by one. So where do you do it? Where do you find the community who wants to engage with your work? And so to that end, I mean, I think a lot of that's out there, and I think theater in quarantine is just sort of a, a perceived example of what's actually already a trend. It's interesting in that Phantom does remain, absolutely. We said we'd go big and we went big. It is our biggest cast for sure. I think it's like eight of us in the room to run it. And with that, it's amazing how much you end up institutionalizing yourself. simply to be responsible to other people. Like that's the irony of it all, right? Like an institution is not inherently bad. It is just an organizational structure to take care of people. And the more people you have involved, the more organization you need. So, it's amazing and sometimes infuriating when I see myself perpetuating the same problems I would have with other institutions. To that end, it's been really exciting to go really big. And I'm sure, in the next project or two, we'll go back to small again and keep oscillating back and forth. Um, but uh, but yeah, I mean, I think we knew we were going to make something about an opera house. We knew we were going to make something that is contending with what it means to both make institutional work right now and not make institutional work right now. And and we managed to do it, from as small a spaces as we know how. So I don't know if I have a wrap up there, but suffice to say, that's it. Yep, no wrap
That's a great wrap up.
up.
Yeah, coming mid-run, I think that's as much of a wrap up as we have any right to expect.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you both so much. It's been such a pleasure. I always love talking to you about the work.
Oh, vice
And
versa.
congratulations,
Wonderful.
happy Halloween, and I hope, yeah, the last few shows are fabulous.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
All
you so
right.
much.